Is this some kind of joke? The voice, sharp and laced with impatience, cut through the low hum of the flight line. Lieutenant Chloe Rivas stood with her hands on her hips, her pristine uniform a stark contrast to the grease-stained fatigues of the maintenance crew surrounding the troubled F-22 Raptor. Her gaze was fixed on the old man standing near the aircraft's nose gear. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the aircraft," she said, her voice louder this time, designed to carry. "This is a restricted area." The man, who looked to be in his 90s, didn't seem startled. He simply turned his head, his calm blue eyes taking in the young officer. He had on a simple windbreaker and a pair of comfortable slacks, looking more like a grandfather who had wandered away from a base tour than anyone who belonged on an active flight line. He held his hands loosely in his pockets, his posture relaxed, almost casual. He was Bud Anderson, though the name meant nothing to the lieutenant. To her, he was just an obstacle, a civilian liability she needed to remove. The Raptor, one of the most advanced fighter jets ever built, sat inert and silent. For 3 days it had been dead on the flight line, plagued by a phantom electrical issue that defied every diagnostic tool and stumped the base's most brilliant technicians. The pressure from command was immense. The last thing Lieutenant Rivas needed was a tourist getting underfoot. "Sir, did you hear me?" Rivas pressed, stepping closer. One of the security force's airmen with her shifted his weight, his hand resting near his sidearm, a gesture of authority that was entirely for show. "I need you to move back to the visitors area." Now, Bud's gaze shifted from the lieutenant to the sleek gray skin of the fighter jet. He seemed to be looking right through the metal, seeing the complex web of wires and processors within. He had been watching the maintenance crew for nearly an hour, observing their frustrated dance of plugging in laptops, running tests, and shaking their heads in defeat. He saw the mounting tension in their shoulders, the exasperation in their sighs. It was a familiar scene to him, one he'd witnessed countless times over a lifetime spent with aircraft. "License and identification, sir," Rivas demanded, her patience gone. She held out her hand, expecting compliance. The crowd of airmen, a mix of maintenance staff and curious onlookers from the base's ongoing Heritage Day event, grew larger. Whispers started to ripple through the assembly. Who was the old guy? Why was the new maintenance officer getting so aggressive? Bud Anderson slowly pulled a thin leather wallet from his back pocket. He didn't make eye contact with Rivas, his attention still on the silent jet. He seemed to be listening to something no one else could hear. Rivas snatched the wallet impatiently, flipping it open to find a state-issued driver's license. "Clarence E. Anderson," she read aloud, a hint of mockery in her tone. "Well, Clarence, your visitor's pass doesn't grant you access to mission-critical hardware. I don't know how you got this far, but your tour is over." She was an officer forged in the modern Air Force, a world of simulators, computer-aided design, and by-the-book procedures. To her, this aircraft was a network of digital systems, a flying supercomputer. The idea that this old man, a relic from a bygone era of analog gauges and hydraulic levers, could have anything to contribute was absurd. "With all due respect, Grandpa," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "this isn't a P-51 Mustang. You can't just kick the tires and hope for the best. This is a fifth-generation fighter. It's more complex than the rocket that sent men to the moon." A few of the younger airmen chuckled, eager to align themselves with their superior. But Master Sergeant Evans, the maintenance chief, winced. He was a 20-year veteran, and he saw something in the old man's quiet demeanor that gave him pause. It wasn't senility or confusion. It was a deep, unshakable confidence. A calm he had only ever seen in the most seasoned pilots and crew chiefs, men who had forgotten more about aircraft than Rivas would ever learn. Bud finally spoke, his voice raspy with age but clear and steady. "It's not the main processor," he said, ignoring her insults. He gestured with his chin toward an access panel just below the cockpit. "The fault isn't in the core system, it's peripheral. The diagnostics are chasing a ghost because they're looking in the wrong place." Rivas scoffed. "And you know this how? Did you get a feeling, a vision?" She handed his wallet back with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "Thank you for your input. Security will show you the way out." She turned her back on him, a clear sign of dismissal, and addressed her team. "All right, let's run the Level 3 diagnostics again. I want a full system reboot." Master Sergeant Evans watched the old man who hadn't moved. Bud's eyes were now on Rivas. There was no anger in them, only a hint of something that looked like pity. Evans felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The lieutenant was crossing a line, and she was doing it in front of half the wing. This was becoming more than a simple matter of an unauthorized civilian. It was a public display of disrespect, and it felt fundamentally wrong. Bud tried one more time. "The problem," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter, is likely harmonic feedback from the generator bus. It's creating a resonance that's barely unseating a connector in the avionics relay. Not enough to register as a full disconnect, but enough to scramble the boot sequence. You're not looking for a broken part, you're looking for a loose one. Rivas spun around, her face flushed with anger. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Harmonic feedback. This isn't a tube amplifier, old-timer. It's a billion-dollar weapon system. She pointed at a small, faded patch sewn onto his windbreaker. It was circular, depicting an eagle with 3 small stars. What's that, your flying club patch? You picked that up at the gift shop on your way in? The moment she said it, the world seemed to slow for Bud. The noisy flight line faded into a dull roar, replaced by the ghost of a different sound, the powerful guttural growl of a Packard Merlin engine at full throttle. For a fraction of a second, the image in his mind was not of a gray F-22, but of the olive-drab wing of his P-51 Mustang, Old Crow. He was a young man again, standing on a makeshift airstrip in Leiston, England, the air thick with the smell of aviation fuel and mud. A fellow pilot was clapping him on the shoulder, congratulating him on his 16th victory. The patch on his flight jacket was brand new, the threads still bright. Triple ace, Bud. You did it. The memory was as vivid as yesterday, a lifetime of service encapsulated in that one small piece of cloth. He blinked, and the vision was gone. He was back on the hot tarmac, an old man being belittled by a young officer who had no concept of the history standing before her. He instinctively touched the patch, the fabric worn smooth by time. His expression remained placid, but his eyes for just a moment held the vast, lonely expanse of the sky. Master Sergeant Evans saw it all. He saw the condescending question, he saw the flash of memory in the old man's eyes, and he saw the lieutenant's utter blindness to what was happening. He had tried to subtly intervene, to suggest to the lieutenant that they should just hear the man out, but she had waved him off too, invested in asserting her authority. Now she was making a call to the security forces command post, her voice sharp and official, requesting an escort to remove Bud Anderson from the base. Evans knew he had to do something. This wasn't just about a broken jet anymore. It was about honor. Slipping away from the growing spectacle, he ducked behind a maintenance vehicle and pulled out his cell phone. He didn't call his immediate superior. He didn't call base security. He scrolled through his contacts to a number he rarely used, the direct line to the aide of the base commander, Colonel Davies. The aide, a sharp young captain, answered on the second ring. Captain Miller. Ma'am, it's Master Sergeant Evans out on the flight line, he said, his voice low and urgent. You need to get the colonel down to the F-22 pad, right now. What is it, Master Sergeant? Is it the Raptor? In a way, ma'am, Evans said, choosing his words carefully. Lieutenant Rivas is about to make the biggest mistake of her career. She's having a civilian guest removed from the flight line by security. A civilian? The captain asked, her tone already shifting to annoyance. The colonel is hosting General Thompson. He can't be bothered with a tourist. Ma'am, Evans insisted, his voice firm. The civilian's name is Anderson, Bud Anderson. There was a sudden, profound silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that is heavier than any sound. When the captain spoke again, all traces of annoyance were gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. Say that name again, Master Sergeant. Colonel C.E. Bud Anderson, ma'am. And Lieutenant Rivas is treating him like a trespasser. The line went dead. Evans didn't need a confirmation. He knew that a storm was about to break. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and turned back toward the scene, his expression grim. The cavalry was on its way. Inside the base commander's stately office, Colonel Davies was showing the visiting 4-star general, General Thompson, a series of logistical charts. It was a routine, if high-level, briefing. The quiet atmosphere was shattered when Captain Miller burst into the room without knocking, her face pale. Colonel, General, I am so sorry to interrupt, she said, her voice breathless. Colonel Davies looked up, his brow furrowed with irritation. Captain, what is so important that it can't wait? Sir, we have a code red of a sort, she stammered, trying to find the right words. On the flight line, Lieutenant Rivas is in a confrontation with a guest. And, the colonel prompted, his patience wearing thin. The captain took a deep breath. Sir, the guest is Colonel Bud Anderson. The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. Colonel Davies, a man who had commanded entire wings and faced down congressional committees, felt the blood drain from his face. General Thompson, who had been idly tracing a supply route on a map, snapped his head up. His eyes, which had been placid moments before, were now wide with disbelief. Bud Anderson, the general asked, his voice a low rumble. Are you telling me the Bud Anderson is on our flight line right now? Yes, General, Captain Miller confirmed, and Lieutenant Rivas has called security forces to have him removed. The general was already on his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. He snatched his service cap from the corner of the desk. "Colonel Davies," he commanded, his voice ringing with an authority that left no room for discussion. "Get me a vehicle. Now, let's go." Back at the grounded F-22, Lieutenant Rivas was playing her final card. A security vehicle had pulled up and two young airmen, barely out of their teens, approached cautiously. They looked from the stern, unyielding lieutenant to the calm, elderly man and seemed deeply uncertain. "I want this man removed from my flight line," Rivas ordered, pointing a rigid finger at Bud. "He is a security risk and is actively obstructing a mission-critical repair. Take his information. I'll be filing a formal complaint to have his base access permanently revoked." She turned to Bud, her expression a mask of triumphant disdain. "You've had your chance to leave quietly, sir. Now you'll be escorted out. Maybe a chat with the defenders will remind you what a restricted area means." This was her moment of victory, the final assertion of her control. The security airmen exchanged a nervous glance, clearly uncomfortable with manhandling a man who could be their great-grandfather. Suddenly, the piercing wail of a siren cut through the air, but it wasn't from a backup security car. A black command vehicle, the kind reserved for the highest-ranking officers, sped onto the tarmac, its tires squealing as it swerved to a halt just yards away. A golf cart carrying the four-star general was right behind it. Before the vehicle had fully stopped, the passenger door flew open and Colonel Davies leaped out. He was a man on a mission, his face a thunderous mask of controlled fury. The general disembarked more slowly from his cart, his expression one of immense gravity and profound respect. The entire flight line froze. The hum of activity ceased. Maintenance crews stopped in their tracks. The two young security airmen snapped to attention, their eyes wide. Lieutenant Rivas's triumphant smirk dissolved, replaced by a look of utter confusion. What was happening? Colonel Davies marched with purpose, his eyes locked on Bud Anderson. He strode right past Lieutenant Rivas as if she were invisible, his polished boots eating up the concrete. He stopped directly in front of Bud, clicked his heels together, and rendered the sharpest, most profound salute of his entire career. "Colonel Anderson, sir," he boomed, his voice echoing across the now silent tarmac. "It is an honor to have you on my base. I am Colonel Davies. My deepest, most sincere apologies for any misunderstanding you may have experienced." General Thompson came to a halt beside him and executed an equally sharp salute. "Bud, you old son of a gun," the general said, his formal tone melting away into genuine heartfelt warmth as he lowered his hand. "I can't believe it's really you. What are you doing letting these youngsters give you a hard time?" A wave of collective shock washed over the crowd. Jaws dropped. Airmen exchanged stunned, disbelieving looks. Lieutenant Rivas's face cycled through a spectrum of emotions from confusion to dawning comprehension, and finally to a ghastly sheet-white horror. The ground beneath her feet seemed to vanish. Colonel Davies turned to face the assembled personnel, his voice resonating with power and shame. "For those of you who do not know," he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before landing squarely on Rivas, "you are in the presence of a living legend. This is Colonel Clarence Bud Anderson, a World War II triple ace with 16 1/4 confirmed aerial victories. He flew 116 combat missions in his P-51 Mustang, Old Crow, and he did it without ever taking a single hit from enemy fire. He never had to turn back for any reason, not once." A murmur of pure awe rippled through the airmen. The name Old Crow was iconic, a piece of aviation lore they had all heard about. After the war, the colonel continued, his voice filled with reverence. He became a test pilot. He flew everything from the first jets to the F-104 Starfighter. He pushed envelopes and wrote the book on flight characteristics that we still study today. This man has more flight hours in more types of aircraft than everyone on this flight line combined. When he speaks about an airplane, any airplane, you listen. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He is an American hero, and on my base he will be shown the respect he has earned 1,000 times over. The general then turned his attention to the mortified Lieutenant Rivas. His voice was not loud, but it was cold, sharp, and carried with an unnerving intensity. "Lieutenant, what is your name?" "Rivas, sir," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Chloe Rivas." "Lieutenant Rivas," the general said, his eyes like chips of ice. "You have a great deal to learn about leadership, and even more to learn about respect. Not just respect for the rank on a person's collar, but for the history on whose shoulders you stand. You looked at this man and saw an obstacle. You saw an old man. We look at him and see one of the giants of aviation. You will report to my aide's office at 1600 hours. We are going to have a long talk about your future." Dismissed. He didn't need to shout. The quiet, surgical precision of his words was devastating. Rivas stood frozen for a moment, her face a portrait of utter ruin before turning and walking away on unsteady legs. Just then, Bud Anderson stepped forward. He placed a gentle, calming hand on Colonel Davies's arm. "Easy, Colonel," he said, his voice soft. "The lieutenant is young, eager. She was just doing her job the way she was taught, protective of her aircraft. There's no fault in that." He turned to where Rivas had been standing, speaking loud enough for her to hear. "It's a complicated machine, Lieutenant," he said with surprising kindness. "I can see why you're so protective of it. You should be." The grace of his forgiveness was more profound and more shaming than the general's powerful rebuke. Then, Bud turned back to the silent F-22. He walked over to the access panel he had indicated earlier and tapped it lightly with his knuckle. "You know," he mused, a twinkle in his eye, "we had a similar ghost in the machine with the early F-104s. A harmonic vibration from the generator would ever so slightly unseat a specific relay in the fire control system. Drove us nuts for weeks." He glanced down at the faded triple ace patch on his windbreaker. For a second the scene flashed again. Not to a war-torn field in England, but to a sun-baked hangar at Edwards Air Force Base in the 1950s. A younger Bud in a test pilot's flight suit stood with a group of frantic engineers around a large schematic of the F-104 starfighter. His finger was pointing decisively to a small, unassuming relay in a complex wiring diagram. The same principle, the same problem, separated by 70 years of aviation technology. The wisdom was timeless. Master Sergeant Evans, who had been watching with a sense of vindicated awe, needed no further prompting. "Sergeant Miller," he barked at his best avionics technician. "Get a toolkit, open panel 2B7, right where Colonel Anderson indicated." The technician, moving with a newfound sense of purpose, quickly unlatched the panel. Inside was a dense nest of wires and connectors. He carefully followed the path Bud had suggested, his light tracing the bundles. "Whoa, wait a minute," the tech said, his voice filled with surprise. "I see it. The main avionics bus connector. It's not loose, but it's not fully seated either. It's off by maybe a millimeter." It was a flaw so minor, so subtle, that a standard diagnostic check, looking for a complete break in the circuit, would have missed it entirely. It was exactly as Bud had described, a ghost. With a gentle push, the technician clicked the connector firmly into place. "It's seated, Chief." "All right," Evans commanded, his heart pounding. "Let's try it. Run the full APU start sequence." A moment of tense silence fell over the flight line. Then a low whine began to build, escalating into the familiar powerful roar of the Raptor's auxiliary power unit. The cockpit screens, dark and lifeless for 3 days, flickered to life one by one, glowing with lines of green text. All systems nominal. All checks green. The F-22 was alive. A spontaneous cheer erupted from the assembled crews. It was a sound of relief, of triumph, and of deep respect for the old man who had seen what millions of dollars of technology could not. In the days that followed, the story of Bud Anderson and the Raptor spread like wildfire across the base and beyond. Colonel Davies mandated a new base-wide training module on Air Force heritage, emphasizing the contributions of past generations. Lieutenant Rivas received a formal but private counseling. True to his character, Bud Anderson had personally spoken to the general, requesting that her career not be derailed. "The lesson itself is what matters," he had said. "She's learned it. Let that be enough." About a week later, Rivas, now in civilian clothes, was visiting the base museum. She was looking at a black and white photo of a P-51 Mustang with the words "Old Crow" painted on its nose when she saw him. Bud Anderson was standing a few feet away, quietly observing the same display. She approached him hesitantly, her hands clasped nervously behind her back. "Colonel Anderson, sir," she began, her voice soft. "I just wanted to find you, to apologize again, properly. There's no excuse for my behavior. I was arrogant, and I was wrong." Bud turned from the display, and a gentle smile touched his lips. "Don't apologize for being thorough, Lieutenant. That's a good quality in an officer," he said kindly. "Just learn to look past the surface. Sometimes the oldest engines have the most important lessons to teach." He looked back at the picture of his younger self, a world away. The machines change, but the principles and the people, they stay pretty much the same. In that quiet museum surrounded by the ghosts of aviation past, a young officer and a living legend shared a moment of understanding, a passing of the torch built not on technology or procedure but on wisdom and humility. Bud Anderson's story is a powerful reminder that heroes walk among us, often in the quietest forms. If you were inspired by his wisdom and humility, please like this video, Share it with a friend and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories of unassuming heroes who deserve to be remembered.